WWE has had a long history of great in-ring performers, as we've seen with the likes of Bret Hart, Shawn Michaels, and Eddie Guerrero. And this is also the case for today's subject, as Gunther has proven to be one of the greatest in-ring technicians of his generation. But how did he get to this point? Well, join us today as we take a deep dive into his entire career journey so far in Ring General, the Gunther story. Walter Hahn was born August 20th, 1987 in Vienna, Austria, and it was there that from a young age he became fascinated with the world of wrestling. As happened with many people once they reached their teenage years though, the youngster began to fall away from wrestling once he started to become more enamored with soccer, with his team of choice being the German Bundesliga squad FC Schalke 04. In fact, so interested would he be in soccer back then, he'd start playing regularly as a goalie, all in the hopes that this would eventually lead to him getting a chance to turn pro. But while Walter would eventually go pro as an athlete, it wouldn't be in the world of soccer. No, after rediscovering wrestling again during the Attitude Era, he decided this has been his real passion all along. And that's what caused him to start training in the ways of the ring himself after coming across Michael Kovac and the Wrestling School of Austria at the start of the 2000s. How would this training go for the rookie? Would the €35 he was being asked to pay for lessons, a fortune for him at the time, be worth the money? Yes, it would, as almost immediately he took to the craft like a duck to water. Hell, you could call him a prodigy. And so it was that by the time 2005 came around, he'd be ready to start hitting the ring on the local Austrian indie shows where he went by the name of Big Van Walter, a reference to the legendary Big Van Vader. Not that Walter was happy with being given this moniker at first though, as he found it a little too limiting. And that was why he'd soon drop it in favor of simply going by his Christian name. And while this might have sounded like a questionable name for a wrestler at first, the fact that he was such a powerhouse, such a stiff and brutal worker, made it work, as seeing the kinds of matches he was having coming from a guy named Walter just fit for some strange reason. Needless to say then, almost immediately the Vienna native would become something of a splash on his local indie scene. And the notoriety he gained there, getting to have early matches against the likes of Colt Cabana and Pac, soon led to him getting to tour the world and show off his skills in other places as well. Where would some of these places be? Well, Japan for one. Yes, it was out in the land of the rising sun that Walter got to wrestle for the likes of Pro Wrestling 01 Max, all while he was doing additional training in their dojos and further honing his craft. And when he wasn't doing that, he was over in Germany making a new home base for himself in West Side Extreme Wrestling, the very place he'd eventually become a four-time WXW World Tag Team Champion alongside partners like Zack Sabre Jr., Timothy Thatcher, and Ilya Dragunov, as well as a three-time WXW Unified World Wrestling Champion. So to say the Austrian wasn't fast rising up the ranks here would be a lie. No, he was clearly one to watch for the future, especially as his in-ring style of chopping people until they're dead stood out so much amidst a sea of high flyers and acrobats. Of course, it wasn't all about title wins while Walter was in West Side Extreme Wrestling though. No, it was also about having the best match on the card, something he almost always did whenever he stepped into the ring. That said, it helped that given his increased notoriety by now, all the best workers wanted to mix it up with him, and that meant aside from getting to partner up with people like Zack Sabre Jr. and Timothy Thatcher, he also got a chance to square off against the likes of Jon Moxley and El Generico, all while he was also forming a stable around himself named Catch Hools. Would it be Catch Hools who led the up-and-comer to that first big world title win? Yes, in the sense that they were standing in his corner when he beat Zack Sabre Jr. for this in March of 2010, but it wasn't like he needed them there. No, the future Gunther was more than capable of handling himself without any outside aid, and this was something he'd prove when he ended up holding on to the WXW Unified World Wrestling Championship for the next 383 days, with all this happening before he'd even turned 25. Truly, what fans of the German promotion were seeing here was a superstar being born. And they weren't the only ones seeing it, because by now, after winning the WXW Unified World Wrestling Championship for a second time, Walter had started making his way across the channel over to the UK too, where he was regularly found working on their indie circuit for places like Progress Wrestling and Revolution Pro Wrestling. Hell, it was in the UK that he'd first get to stand on the opposite side of the ring from all new opponents, like Jordan Devlin, Eddie Kingston, Brody Lee, and Tommy End, better known today as Malachi Black. Still though, for as much fun as the Austrian was having over in England, it was West Side Extreme Wrestling that remained his home. And it was there that in 2014, after rebranding himself as Big Daddy Walter for a while, he'd have his third run with that promotion's top prize. Who would some of his challengers be this go-around? Well, that would be names like Johnny Gargano and Chris Hero. And proving just how good he was by this point, Walter was able to dispatch each of these performers, as well as everyone else who came up against him, with relative ease. Yes, the reality is that if you were stepping in the ring with the Austrian, you were going to have to prepare to get beaten up, as there was simply nothing else going on in the wrestling back then which compared to what he was doing. And that style continued to work wonders for him as 2015 came around, or at least it did until Vince Russo showed up in Westside Extreme Wrestling as the company's kayfabe new investor, and then proceeded to screw the champion out of his gold. So, needing to pick himself back up again if he was ever going to recover, Big Daddy Walter decided to move back to tag team action for a while, with this being the point he teamed up with Zack Sabre Jr. to win the WXW World Tag Team Championship after beating Red Dragon for the honor. Meanwhile, back over in the UK, the big man would continue working for Progress and Rev Pro, with it being in the latter that he came painfully close to earning a shot at the undisputed British Heavyweight Championship after stepping into the ring with Big Damo, Jonathan Gresham, and Tomohiro Ishii. Ultimately, though, a few notable losses in Rev Pro meant Big Daddy Walter would not get his shot at that gold, and with this also being around the time he and Zack Sabre Jr. came up short in a tag title defense back over in Germany, it was clear to the boy from Vienna that he needed to shake things up again. So that was exactly what he did in 2016 when he dropped Zack, started calling himself simply Walter again, and began aligning himself with Axel Dieter Jr. and Timothy Thatcher to create Ringkampf, a group of mat-based shooters who operated on the belief that the mat was a sacred place and not something to be sullied with theatrics. No, from now on, whenever any of these three men were in the ring, there would be no goofiness, and there would certainly be no high-flying or acrobatics. Instead, there will be simple meat-and-potatoes wrestling, the kind that the likes of Karl Gotch and Lou Thesz had made famous decades before. And with this change, Walter was finally able to reach his final form, as now whenever he wrestled, he truly felt like the best wrestler in the world, and the best representative of what the sport could be when it was at its purest. Obviously then, once Ringkampf were firmly established in Westside Extreme Wrestling, Der Ring General's stock began to rise all over again, and that would lead to him having excellent performances there between 2016 and 2017 against opponents like Matt Riddle, Speedball Mike Bailey, and Jeff Cobb. And while this was happening, back over in the UK for Progress Wrestling, the trio would be tearing it up against a whole host of other opponents too. Opponents such as the British Strong Style trio made up of Pete Dunne, Trent Seven, and Tyler Bate. Yes, there weren't many people on the 2010s indie circuit who Walter hadn't faced off against at this point and had a banger with in the process. And that understandably led to people asking if he would inevitably get signed up to WWE at some point. But with the Austrian not wanting to move to America at that time, this was seemingly off the cards for him. No, instead it would be Axel Dieter Jr. who would be the first member of Ringkampf to be signed in April of 2017, with this leaving the group to have to reassemble again as a duo. Not that they were slowed down by such an act though. No, by the time it was over, Walter and Timothy Thatcher would be in possession of the WXW World Tag Team Championships. And that was only a taster for what was to come as it happened, because in the spring of 2018, Walter would add another trophy to his increasingly full cabinet when he beat Travis Banks to become the Progress Unified World Champion over in the UK. Then, once he'd won this belt, he'd head over to America to start performing for Pro Wrestling Guerrilla, with it being here that, after competing in the annual Battle of Los Angeles tournament, he not only won the PWG World Tag Team titles with Timothy Thatcher, but he also defeated Keith Lee and Jonah Rock in a three-way bout on April 21st to become the PWG World Champion too. Honestly, at this point, it was easier to list the things the future World Heavyweight Champion hadn't achieved yet, and any of those things he hadn't yet done, he soon would, as around this time, he also began making appearances for Evolve, there becoming a semi-regular against performers like Chris Dickinson, Adam Cole, and Darby Allin. Outside of that, there was his time spent in Ireland for Over the Top Wrestling, the very place where, in August of 2018, Walter beat Jordan Devlin to become the OTT champion. And after winning that belt, the big man would go on to have what at the time was arguably a career best run with it, as he defended against not only old opponents like Pac, but also new ones in David Starr and Will Ospreay, all before dropping it back to Devlin again following 210 days of being in possession of it. Why had Walter dropped the OTT title here? Well, because by this point, we were reaching the end days of his indie run. That's right, despite holding off on going to WWE for so long on account of not wanting to move to America, it was in November of 2018 that a new avenue towards the WWE opened up for him with the creation of NXT UK, an entirely British-based branch of the developmental brand that would see the Austrian be allowed to work for the company, all while remaining in Europe. So with NXT UK being his new home for the future, it meant it was time to go on a farewell run of all his old haunts. And that's what led to goodbye bouts in places like Progress, OTT, Rev Pro, and most importantly, Westside Extreme Wrestling, with his last full-time match in the latter coming when Ringkampf dropped their tag team titles to Aussie Open. After that, it was all NXT UK for the big man, and he certainly made an early splash on this brand when, in January of 2019, at TakeOver Blackpool, he made a surprise appearance to confront then NXT United Kingdom champion Pete Dunne. Would this lead to a feud breaking out between the two? Of course it would. And when the inevitable title match eventually happened at TakeOver New York just 3 months later on April 5th, it would be there that Walter dethroned the incoming champ and started his own lengthy reign on top. And we mean lengthy here because for the next 870 days, there would be no one who could take that title away from Der Ring General. Sure, part of the reason for this was because the bulk of the reign happened during lockdown, and so matches were further and fewer between, but even then, to say this was an impressive run on top would be an understatement, as during his time with the strap, the future Intercontinental Champion would defend against everyone who was put up against him, with his list of opponents here including the likes of Tyler Bate, Adam Cole, Joe Coffey, Tommaso Ciampa, and Ilya Dragunov. Hell, the first bout Walter had against Dragunov on the October 29th, 2020 episode of NXT UK TV was so good, it actually managed to stand out during a period where no fans were in attendance at WWE shows. In fact, you could argue it was actually one of the very rare matches that was better for this, because with there being no crowd noise to drown things out, it meant every chop, every strike between the two in their insanely stiff bout sounded like a gunshot going off. Of course, Walter would end up winning this one, as he had with every defense up until then, but then it was a lot easier for him to be confident about winning on NXT UK, as by now he'd assembled a new stable around himself, one made up of allies both old and new. Yes, this group named Imperium, which served as a spiritual successor to Ringkampf in that they would also go by the mantra that the mat was sacred, would include not only Fabian Eichner and Alexander Wolf, but also the big man's old Westside Extreme Wrestling cohort Alex Dieter Jr., with Dieter now going by the moniker of Marcel Bartel. In the end though, even with Imperium by his side, Walter's time was going to have to run out sooner or later, and that ultimately happened for him when, at TakeOver 36 on August 22nd, 2021, not long after fans had returned to arenas, he dropped his NXT United Kingdom title to Ilya Dragunov during their highly anticipated rematch. How would he bounce back after this? Well, by moving up to NXT's US branch full-time. That's right, after years of fighting it, the Vienna native finally decided to move to America, and with him now being available to show up on the black and gold brand on a regular basis going forward, Triple H would waste no time in going all in with him by changing his name to Gunther and having him enter into rivalries with the likes of L.A. Knight and Braun Breaker. And not long after this, Gunther would get his official main roster call-up alongside Marcel Bartel. And so it was then that on the June 20th, 2022 episode of SmackDown, he would become Intercontinental Champion after beating Ricochet for that honor. With even more good news coming Gunther's way when Triple H began to take over as head of creative, someone who was a huge fan of the new Intercontinental Champion and who was going to book him strong. As you can probably guess then, from that point onwards, Gunther's time as Intercontinental Champion would be fantastic, with it being one of the best title runs WWE had seen in years. Seriously, Gunther was showing up week in and week out being the absolute workhorse, and he'd continue to put on banger after banger on the blue brand and the red brand once he was eventually moved over to Raw too. Yes, it didn't matter if it was Shinsuke Nakamura, Rey Mysterio, Braun Strowman, or Sheamus who he was going up against. Every Gunther title defense became appointment TV right at a time WWE was beginning to undergo its renaissance. Hell, his match against Sheamus at September 3rd, 2022's Clash at the Castle would be so good, many would herald it as being one of the greatest matches in decades. Obviously then, this put the Master of the Chop on top of the world, and his position there was only strengthened once Fabian Eichner joined the main roster too, and Imperium once more became a three-man act. Where could Gunther possibly go after this? Well, he'd enter into the 2023 Royal Rumble and there steal the show by entering at number 1 and hanging in the ring for a full 1 hour, 11 minutes, and 40 seconds before being eliminated by eventual winner Cody Rhodes, with this breaking the record for the longest single Royal Rumble performance. Following that, he'd walk into WrestleMania 39, still the Intercontinental Champion, looking to defend against the double threat of Sheamus and Drew McIntyre. Of course, while many may have thought this was the end of Gunther's reign, it would not be. No, by the time that triple threat bout was all said and done, the Austrian would still be standing tall. And as if things couldn't be going any better for him in his life at this point, it would also be around that time that he and his longtime girlfriend, wrestler Ginny, would get married in a ceremony held in London. But he had no time to settle down and enjoy married life as, still the Intercontinental Champion, the big man had dates to fulfill and defenses to make. And these defenses would include beating Mustafa Ali at May 27th's Night of Champions, Matt Riddle at July 1st's Money in the Bank, and Drew McIntyre again at August 5th's SummerSlam. Seriously, at this point, it looked like Gunther might just hold on to the secondary prize for the rest of time. In fact, by now, he was actually approaching the Honky Tonk Man's record for the longest ever IC title reign at 454 days. The only person that stood in his way of breaking this anymore was one Chad Gable. But while Gable may have been the sentimental favorite going into the pair's showdown on the September 4th, 2023 episode of Raw, in the end, it would be Gunther who retained, with this allowing to break the record and officially become the longest reigning Intercontinental Champion of all time. But even then, the boy from Vienna wasn't done. No, before the year was out, he'd have further successful defenses against the likes of Tommaso Ciampa, Bronson Reed, and The Miz. And as 2023 ended, then he'd be able to go home to celebrate the birth of his first child, safe in the knowledge that he was making his kid proud by holding on to that particular piece of hardware for as long as he was. How would 2024 go for the new dad once he returned to the ring? Well, exactly the way 2023 had, because in the first few months of the year, he'd rack up additional victories over Kofi Kingston and Jey Uso. Unfortunately for him, however, time was coming on his reign, and that time would be at WrestleMania 40, as it was there that after a war with Sami Zayn, Gunther finally dropped the IC strap. But considering his run had lasted for a full 666 days, it meant he wasn't exactly going to slip down the card afterwards. No, he'd remain a very focused upon act over on the Raw brand, and that would see him be entered into the King of the Ring tournament when the time for this came around in April. Yes, like the final boss he was fast becoming, Gunther went on to win the King of the Ring after beating Randy Orton in the finals at King and Queen of the Ring on May 25th. And because he won this, it would mean he'd get to challenge Damian Priest for the World Heavyweight title at August 3rd's SummerSlam. Of course, by that point, Priest was on a hell of a run, so there was some doubt as to whether or not Gunther would be able to topple him. But anyone who had any doubts about the Austrian's chances were proven wrong when at the biggest show of the summer, he beat the champ with relative ease to start his first reign as a world champion on the WWE main roster. And that's where things stand today, because ever since August of 2024, Gunther has remained the King of Raw, with his list of victims over the course of his reign including Randy Orton, Sami Zayn, Finn Balor, and Damian Priest once more. Where will he be in 2025? More than likely, he'll still be on top. In fact, we fully expect to see him roll into WrestleMania 41 in April, still with the gold around his waist. Of course, the question remains as to who he might end up facing at that show. Some have suggested it might be CM Punk, others meanwhile have suggested it may be Seth Rollins. Hell, others have put forward that it could be a younger talent like Braun Breaker or a legend like Bill Goldberg. Whoever it is, they'll have to bring their A-game, because based on what we've seen so far, Gunther doesn't look like someone willing to drop that title anytime soon. No, if he has his way, he'll be the champ for a long time to come yet.